Hey guys, SpeedyJ here, coming at you with a Gamecube Controller guide. Now I didn't really want to call this a tutorial since I wasn't going to be making any actual changes or modifications to this controller. Rather, we'll be taking a look at the anatomy of it and how each of its individual components affect you as a smasher. We can also look at some potential modifications you could consider making, and also share some tips and tricks I learned from opening up a couple of these. So, getting started, to open one of these up, you'll need one of these, which is a tri-wing screwdriver. These aren't exactly what I'd call standard, but you can pick up one of these online for a few dollars. Just to save some time, I've already unscrewed everything, and yeah, so let's open this up. So there are 6 holes, 2 at the top, 2 in the middle, 2 at the bottom. Right, so as we take this apart, we can see that the controller's the controller is broken up into 3 main parts. You have the back of the shell, which houses the triggers. You have the middle of the controller, which has, which is the motherboard, has everything you need. And then we have the top of the controller, which houses the buttons. So we'll take a look at the top of the controller first. Now, when it comes to, I guess, button pressing, there are 2 major areas of concern to a player, at least in my opinion. The first one is the ease at which you can switch between buttons, and the second one is the ease at which you can press the buttons. So what I mean by that, at least for the first one, is you'll have Space Animals players, trying to multi-shine. For characters in general, you'll try to be doing your short hop aerials, so you want to quickly transition from Y to A, or in the case of Fox and Falco, Y to B to Y to B to Y to B. Now, you'll notice that when we look at it from the side, the Y button and the X button, so both jump buttons, are noticeably taller than A and B. So yeah, the first modification we could look at making is perhaps reducing the height of your jump buttons. So just remove that for now. So what you could do is maybe get some sandpaper, sand it along the base, not the top, the base, to reduce it by a few millimeters. Obviously, consult your TOs first, and I don't claim any responsibility for any adverse effects that might happen to your controller. Yeah, just a word of warning there. So yeah, that's, if we were to reduce the button height to, so that Y was more akin to A and B, it might be faster, just sliding between the buttons. I haven't actually tried this yet, but it's something that I've always been very interested to try, so yeah. Now, the second part I mentioned, or second major aspect I mentioned, was the ease at which you can press buttons. So some players, at least myself, will find that new controllers have very stiff buttons. Sometimes the short hops don't register as easily. You gotta put a bit of effort to push the button, and then it ends up like you get the full hop instead of the short hop. I don't know. So a trick that I do is, if a good controller goes out, or if a controller where I'm happy with the button pad goes out, I just open it up and switch the old button pad, which I like, for the new button pad in this new controller. So this button pad is actually from my white controller, which I used to use. Everything gave out except for the button pad, so I thought, hey, why not? I'll just put this into the the silver controller, which I now use, and it works great. It's more of a time saver than anything, and it's always something to keep in mind, especially when you're chucking your old controllers away or whatnot. Right, so the next part I thought we'd look at is the motherboard of the controller. It's where all the action happens. Nothing too much to look at here, except one thing I would like to point out is the sticks. You'll notice that once you remove the caps, the stick for the C stick and the main joystick are actually the same. Yeah. So I remember seeing a thread on Smashboards a couple of years ago where players recommended once your main stick gave out, it wouldn't be a bad idea to just remove the C stick and switch it with the regular stick. Yeah, just because the C-stick isn't prone to wearing out as quickly, unless you're a Peach player, but then, you know, it's only one direction. You have the other ones as well. Just kidding, shoutouts to Peach players. So yeah, that's the only recommendation or comment I really had about the motherboard. The other, I guess the last one is the motherboard of the controller is the only aspect of it you really can't replace. Like, for example, we can switch out the buttons, the button pad, we can shave down the buttons. With the triggers, we can replace those as well, which I'll get into later. But this is the only thing you can't really change. So, needless to say, it's important for players to find a good controller with a good stick and stick with it. Ha ha ha, pun intended. So, yeah, I mean, not all controllers are created equal. Like, some are better at pivoting than others, some can shield drop a bit better. And that's why I think it's important to stick with what you have. But some players will encounter a problem where their thumb caps begin to wear out. So as you can see for my one, the ridges at the top are kind of disappearing. And this becomes a bit of a problem because, you know, once all the ridges like start disappearing and you're in a tournament, you know, you have the nerves, your hands are sweaty, you might lose your grip and it messes up your execution. So what I do is I just find a controller I like and then replace the thumb cap. This is probably the second or third thumb cap I've gone through, but it helps a lot and saves you the trouble of having to find a new, like, quote-unquote perfect controller. So yeah, recycling thumb caps, not a bad idea either. Alright, last but not least, we have the base. It houses the triggers, and Nintendo made a very interesting design choice here. Because rather than going with the tri-wing screws, because there are, you know, screws in the casing of the trigger, they've actually gone with the standard four-pronged, four-sided screws, the ones that make the X shape. So I'm not too sure. So you'll need a regular screwdriver for that. If you don't have one lying around your house, have a look in your glasses repair kits, and if not, you can always stop by your local hardware store and pick one up for a few dollars. So now that we removed that, let's take out the black casing and have a look at the trigger itself. Alright, so taking a look here, we can see that the trigger is made up of, well, in this case, 4 main parts. You have the cap of the trigger, you have the black base, there is a spring in there, and there's this metal bar. Now I wanted to take this opportunity to discuss the triggers of the new controllers, because I see online a lot of people have problems with those. They say that the triggers aren't very pleasant to press and sometimes they get stuck, and I found those accusations largely to be true. Sometimes, like when you press the new controllers at an angle, it has a bit of trouble depressing, and then it gets stuck, comes back up a bit slower, and that's obviously not good for a Smash player. An easy fix to this is to simply switch the old trigger caps with the new trigger caps. I found that the new trigger caps were marginally thicker than the old ones, which is why they had trouble depressing trouble being pressed at an angle. But once you put in the old trigger cap, it'll go through very nicely again. I actually made that fix for one of my friends a while back. Another difference between the new and the old controllers, so aside from the trigger caps, is the presence of this metal bar. Now, what I believe the metal bar is used for is it helps return the trigger to the original position, so it just helps with your pressing. Now, this isn't something I feel that breaks the game or gives players an unfair advantage over the other. I've played with controllers with and without the metal bar, and I feel the difference is hardly noticeable. So if you have one, great. If you don't, then I wouldn't lose sleep over it. I don't think you're going to be at a particular disadvantage. I was reading online, and some people thought that it was actually the metal bar that made the new controllers play better than the old ones. But that's actually not true. It's really to do with the trigger cap, because putting the metal bar into the new controller doesn't help when pressing the triggers at an angle. Alright. Now, the last difference between the old controllers and the new controllers, I'll just remove this metal bar for a bit, is the spring. Now, this is the spring from the old controller. It's, you know, from the silver controller, as you can see here. Now, this is a spring from the new white Japanese controllers. And I've opened up a couple of the Smash 4 ones, the white Japanese ones, and they all have this spring and do not have this metal bar. Why Nintendo decided to make this design change, I don't really know. Functionally, I don't notice much of a difference between the two springs when it comes to L canceling and wave dashing. I mean, both work fine. The only thing I did notice is that the shorter springs are slightly easier to power shield with. Because when I power shield, I tried to get the hard shield rather than the light shield, and well, the small spring gets me into hard shield a lot better. Well, not a lot better, just a bit better. So I guess the reason for that is because when you're trying to power shield, you're trying to hit the base of this faster, and when there are fewer rungs, it's just easier to get that full shield. Yeah, that's all I really noticed. So the last thing I wanted to talk about the controllers is, oh, just another thing. It's interesting that old controllers come with this and new controllers come with this. I've also found that some of the old controllers, like your purple ones, original GameCube black ones, they actually come with this spring. So I think it's possible that Nintendo decided that the longer springs were better than the shorter springs, and yeah, they just decided to go with these. But yeah, if you find a controller, well, an old controller with one of these, don't be too surprised. I found some of them did have them. Right, so moving on to the base, the third part of the trigger. Yeah, so we have the black base. Now, what this is for is, well, rather than explaining what this is for, I'll explain a situation in which you would need to switch this. So, a couple months back, I was having some problems with this controller. I felt the triggers to be, for lack of a better word, squishy, and I would have trouble executing my tech skill. So for example, I'd be missing my wave dashes or wave lands when I had been, pressing the trigger. My index fingers would start to hurt after long hours of playing. I would often miss my L cancels even though I thought I pressed it. And the reason for that is because the base of the trigger has worn out. You'll find that there's actually a bit of rubber at the bottom, which we can remove. And this, I'll just show you. I don't really want to remove this. Yeah, so there's this base of the rubber. You can just pull it out. And this rubber had worn out. And that's why I was missing everything, because it wasn't registering very nicely, and I was having to hard press all the time to make sure it registered, which is why my index finger started hurting after a while. At first I thought the culprit was the spring, because I figured, well, hey, maybe if I got a new spring, the responsiveness would improve. But that actually wasn't true. I tried with some other short springs and some other long springs, but that didn't really seem to help. And when I found that I replaced the black base of the trigger, because what I did was I just transplanted an entire trigger. I didn't take it apart, so I just got this whole thing and in another controller and put it in this one. It started working great again. So if you find that you're having problems with your triggers registering your moves, it is most likely this black thing that needs to be changed. So a common fix that some players might do is they'll have this old, really beat up controller, like an old generation one, which isn't really any good anymore. And they will have a new controller which has crappy triggers. Something I could recommend doing is just removing the trigger and transplanting it pretty much. So I would bring over the trigger cap and the spring, but I would leave the trigger base just because, well, the new one's probably going to be more responsive since your old one probably has a couple of years of use on it. So I would just make that transplant, and then you won't have the trigger problem anymore. You'll have a new base, so having your inputs shouldn't be too difficult. That's actually what I sort of did here, except what I did the reverse. I kept the spring in the cap, and I just replaced the base. So just some useful tips there. Alright. Now, when putting the controller back together, well, the trigger back together, I would be very careful with the screws, because these screws, I feel, are a little bit brittle, and if you aren't careful, especially when unscrewing it for the first time, you may end up damaging your screw. So take a look at one of the screws here. I'm not sure if you can see that, but the X shape on this particular screw isn't well defined anymore, and that's just because when I was originally unscrewing it, I had some trouble, and well, long story short, the screwdriver ended up damaging my screw. So when you're unscrewing it for the first time, put a bit of effort into it to make sure that it unscrews properly, and you don't just damage the ridges inside your screw. And when you're rescrewing it, I wouldn't bother trying to make them too tight. I'd just screw them to the point that they're not loose and that they don't protrude from the black housing. So in case you decide to open it up again, you won't have too many problems there. Now we'll move on to reassembly. So what we could do here is, well, I know it's not exactly rocket science, but the first time I took a controller apart, it took me a while to figure out where everything sort of went. So I'll share with you a trick that I do all the time now. I start with the top of the controller, make sure everything aligns well, no buttons are sticking out, and then put the motherboard on it upside down. So, alright. Now with the motherboard, make sure that the hole in your controller cord goes above this pole that's closest to the middle of the controller. It needs to go in there. Right, now that everything fits in place, make sure the triggers are up, and then put the back over this one. And now it's a good fit. So now you'll get to see me just screwing back everything. So while I'm doing this, I also wanted to mention another potential modification you could do with your triggers. With the new controller triggers, I understand that not every player will have one of these old school controllers lying around their house, and I thought that another thing you could do to help with your sticky trigger problem was to actually sand the bottom by a few millimeters. So the reason that the old triggers fit in the new controllers nicely and don't stick is because I feel that they are marginally smaller, or marginally less thick than the new controllers. So if you were to get some sandpaper and reduce the thickness by a few millimeters, that may also help with your problem. I've come across some instances of players trying to lubricate the controllers, but I personally have no experience there, and I wouldn't recommend it. So now that we've discussed the contents, the insides of the controller, the only last thing I wanted to talk about was shield dropping. Now, not all controllers are created equal. Some have an easier time shield dropping than others. I talked about it earlier with the when I was discussing the motherboard. And unfortunately, that's something that's just always going to be the case. You have to get lucky to get a good controller that can shield drop. As I've been experimenting with what affects shield dropping, I found that there were three main aspects which affect it. The first of which is obviously the motherboard, and that is hands down the most important part. And yeah, it's to do with the calibration of the stick and the ease at which you can hit your perfect shield drop angles. Once you have one that can shield drop well, you will never want to part with it. The second aspect was the joystick cap. Now, this, as I've mentioned before, this isn't my first joystick cap on this controller, and it certainly won't be the last. What I try to do is replace these when the ridges disappear with another newer joystick. But as I tried to do transplants between controllers, I found that some joysticks could not shield drop very well, or not on both sides, in comparison to the previous joysticks. And so I feel that the joystick cap is another factor which influences a controller's ability to shield drop. Not as important as the motherboard, but it's there. So that's why I don't just buy a new Black Smash controller and replace this thumb cap, because it may not shield drop very well. The last thing I thought I would mention, because I mentioned there were three factors, were these screws. What I would do to save time when switching between different thumb caps to try shield dropping with is I would put the controller back together, but I wouldn't screw these in, because if it wasn't a good fit, I would just remove the cap, take off the thumb cap, and save some time. So what I would do is I would hold the controller. It would be a little bit loose, but I'd be holding it in place, and I'd just be, practicing my shield drops. But I found that to be a bit misleading, because sometimes without the screws in, so controller a little bit loose, I would be able to hit my shield drops. But then once I went, okay, it's going well, I'm happy to seal the deal, just put all these back in, reassemble it fully, and then I'd find that, hey, wait a minute, what's happening? I'm missing all of these, getting all spot dodges and stuff. And I believe that is to do with the fact that putting the screws in makes the shell, it sticks the shell together pretty much. And that probably affects the angles at which you can hit here, because this one tight compared to when loose is different. So I thought I'd just save you guys some time and some confusion if you were trying that sort of thing. So in summary, what we've looked at is we've looked at the buttons, what affects the ease at which you can switch between them, and the ease at which that you can press them. We've looked at each of the sticks. We've also looked at the triggers, and we established that the new triggers are different to the old ones. They have longer springs, they lack the metal bar, and oftentimes the trigger buttons themselves, the caps, are a bit thicker. So we looked at some modifications which can help there. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video, or at least learned something new, and I look forward to seeing you guys soon. Take care.